Mariah Blake, I've been chasing her down because everybody wants to talk to her about her new book. They Poisoned the World, Life and Death in the Age of Forever Chemicals. She comes highly recommended by our friend Bill Boyle. How do you know Bill Boyle? Welcome to Stand Up. Thank you for joining me. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much for having me. Doesn't everybody know Bill Boyle?
That's great. That's a great answer. That's a great answer.
Yeah, we were neighbors and we have kids the same age. So I spent a lot of evenings around the fire in his backyard.
And do you think he's a smart guy, or is he making it all up?
He's incredibly smart.
Yeah.
Everybody in our circle thinks he's, CIA or something.
Good. So it's not just us listeners.
There's lots of speculation about where he gets his knowledge.
I love it. And I also hate it. I will get to the bottom of it someday, but he's great. And I'm really excited that he told me about your book. I'm sure I would have heard about it because it's no secret. It's getting a lot of attention, as it should. Major publisher, just published. You've been working on this issue for years. But before we get into specifically, tell us a little bit more about your background, which, I've looked it all up. I've read the intro to you, but a lot of credibility in your career. You're an investigative journalist. Yes?
I'm an investigative journalist, and for the last decade or so, I have done work that is a combination of investigation and narrative, and oftentimes it has to do with environmental issues. So, but character-driven. People are at the heart of what I do.
Yes, this book has got some really important actual human beings, and at times heart-wrenching to hear their stories, like the first chapter. But it's really important, I think, to tell this story through actual Americans' eyes. Is that why did you write it this way? It's obviously readable that way, more readable about the issue.
Well, honestly, it partly had to do with the way my research unfolded. So I had initially envisioned this as more of a straight investigative book about the chemical industry, and particularly this class of chemicals at the heart of the book, which are commonly known as forever chemicals, but the formal name is per and polyfluoral alkyl substances, or PFAS. And as I was writing the book, so at the time, there was only a handful of communities anywhere in the country that knew that their drinking water was contaminated with these particular chemicals. Although industry knew, and the EPA knew, that it was probably contaminating drinking water all across the country. And in the early phases of my research, stories about the village of Hoosick Falls, New York, started cropping up. And that village has drinking water contamination, drinking water that's contaminated with these chemicals. But the thing that's really piqued my interest was that the only reason the contamination there had come to light is because this unassuming insurance underwriter named Michael Hickey began to suspect that there might be something in the water after losing his father and several friends to cancer. So he tested his own tap water along with some samples collected from the local McDonald's and Dollar General, and he discovered astronomical levels of a particular type of PFAS. So the levels were about 100 times the EPA's current safety standard for that particular chemical.
And that's just where the kind of the part of the story and where it starts in Hoosick Falls, which is a little town in upstate New York, but of course near Albany, I think. But of course, forever chemicals are everywhere, all throughout the planet.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
so
they are. Well, and so the reason I chose, I went up and I met Michael, and he was this really incredibly unlikely activist. So he is clean cut. He has a fear of public speaking. He didn't take much interest in politics or environmental issues. He liked to joke that he got his news from ESPN. And yet this guy was spearheading a fight against several multinational corporations and government agencies to get his community clean drinking water. So I just decided, and there were other people, other community residents who were involved in this fight as well. And they were very similar to Michael in that they weren't political by nature, and yet they had taken up this fight. So what was happening there, and this is really answering your previous question, just fascinated me. So I decided to follow that community, and I followed them for 8 years. And so, but with regards to what you just asked, yes, these chemicals are everywhere. So they persist in the environment for hundreds or even thousands of years, and they are highly mobile. And as a result, they are in the blood of people, and ecosystems everywhere, even in the remotest parts of the globe. And I think the most striking example of just how ubiquitous they are comes from a 2022 study of rainwater around the world. So a group of prominent European scientists looked at the levels of the two best studied PFAS in rainwater around the world, and they found everywhere, including remote regions like the Tibetan Plateau, the levels were high enough to harm human health and the environment, human health and ecosystems. So they were much higher than, say, the EPA's safety standards for these chemicals. And based on this, they concluded that the entire planet is now outside the safe operating space for humanity. That's a quote.
Great.
They're also ubiquitous in consumer goods. So they're in condoms, lipstick, Band-Aids, kitty litter, dental floss, clothing, children's products. They are, they're in thousands of everyday goods. They're in the dust the fine dust particles in the air surrounding us, and they are in the blood of every single one of us.
Not mine.
All right. I would challenge you to test it and find out.
No.
Okay.
I'd rather live in ignorance about some of these things, and I think unfortunately, a lot of people would. But that's why your book and your work is so important. How do you, give credibility? How do you, as a journalist and an author here, deduce the science in terms of the harmfulness of them? It would seem obvious that these things would be bad for you. It's not surprising that you could pass them to your fetus in utero. It's not surprising that they could get in your blood and microplastics and all of it. And when you see what makes up these chemicals, it's totally unsurprising that they could kill you slowly with any type of cancer and so on. But still, scientific evidence is needed to come to conclusions. How do we know, and what do scientists that you talk to say about the consensus around how harmful they are to humans?
Well, the EPA has set a health-based safety standard for the two best studied at 0. So the EPA, which weighed all the evidence that's out there, they determined that there is no safe level of exposure to these chemicals. So they're linked to a long list of ailments, including various types of cancer, thyroid disease, reduced penis size, diminished IQ, life-threatening pregnancy complications. The list goes on and on. And the evidence is overwhelming. There have been studies, numerous studies on animals dating back to the 1960s. Most of them conducted, the earlier ones by industry. But there's now just a huge body of evidence out there, a huge body of science linking these chemicals to disease in people.
So the book digs into Hoosick Falls, the diseases there, people have clearly died, the lawsuits, the legalities of it. Also digs into the history and teaches about the history of the development of these chemicals, both the individual scientists and, of course, the companies. And finally tells us that, the most enraging thing, it's not unlike the oil industry, which of course you've covered, is that they always knew the damage that they were potentially or definitely doing. So where should we go? To history first and what you learned about the development of these chemicals? Because that's pretty fascinating.
I actually think that the history is some of the most fascinating material. In particular, the thing I found most shocking in my research is that the US government developed these chemicals as part of the top secret Manhattan Project. That is not something that's really been documented before. They needed them for uranium enrichment. So just like they had physicists working in labs all over the country developing nuclear fuels, they had chemists in labs all over the country developing these chemicals, which at the time were known as fluorocarbons, because they were needed for uranium enrichment. And it was clear from the outset that these were extremely dangerous chemicals. So the plants where they made them were routinely catching fire and exploding. Workers were constantly being hospitalized. But it wasn't just workers. Farmers downwind started complaining that their peach crops were burning up, that their cows were so crippled that they couldn't stand, and they grazed by crawling on their bellies. And this alarmed Manhattan Project officials because they worried that the farmers would sue and that it would compromise national security and also create liability. And so there was a secret medical research program under the Manhattan Project. And as part of this program, they actually injected unknowing cancer patients with radioactive materials like uranium and plutonium. But they also started studying the health effects of these chemicals in 1943. And by 1945, the US government had determined that these chemicals were toxic and were accumulating in human blood. And that's one of the things that makes them so harmful, is that they stay in your body for years. So some of the information we now have about these chemicals, what makes them so uniquely dangerous, the US government knew in the mid-1940s, but they withheld that information.
Well, see, the reason why I'm okay with all of it is because these plastics, which you're demonizing, these chemicals, which you're demonizing, have given us so many great things. And I only learned that because of you. Like, I'd rather die slowly than not have a Gore-Tex jacket. You know what I'm saying? The joke is about that there was no conspiracy to kill people. There was a conspiracy to make people's lives better, safer, more efficient, like anything else that gets mass produced. Like, right? Tell me about in defense of the products these chemicals were included in that changed our lives.
Well, I mean, they have made a lot of things possible. So they have enabled space travel. They have enabled high-speed computing. They're used in life-saving medical devices. So if you need a patch on a vein or an artery, they will make that out of Teflon because it's breathable and waterproof. So it's used, because of their special properties. So the thing that distinguishes these chemicals is that it's a combination of fluorine and carbon, which together form the strongest bond in chemistry. And as a result, they have these incredible properties. They are incredibly heat resistant. They stand up to chemicals that burn through almost everything else. They're waterproof, grease-proof, non-stick. So they've led to a lot of important innovations, and they've led to things like Teflon pans that make our lives somewhat more convenient. They're also essential to certain green technologies that we're relying on for the transition to a green economy. Essential for some and used in others, and unnecessarily.
So well stated in terms of just several of the different ways they've impacted our lives, definitively and directly. But at some point, they become mass produced and become in everything, and then seep into everything in a number of different ways. And it's hard to necessarily figure out. It's like, an investigation where it's coming from, right? But correlation is not always causation, I guess they say. But a lot of it is in the water. A lot of it comes from different plants. A lot of it is very localized. You talk about, we all have it in our blood. Every mammal probably does, I suppose. If they have it in the glaciers, I think everything else does. But it's in different concentrations, and it affects us differently, obviously. So you can, though, deduce whether it's forever chemicals, PFAS, or lead, what areas have the highest concentrations, and then you could pretty quickly figure out why. Is that a fair conclusion? Did you arrive at that conclusion?
No, I don't think we've even begun to get a handle on where the hot spots are necessarily. So yes, drinking water contamination is a known source of exposure. But another major one that we're just beginning to investigate is farmland. So farmland all across this country since the 1970s, they have spread sewage sludge over farmland as fertilizer. And we're talking tens of millions of acres of farmland. And we're now discovering that sewage sludge is highly contaminated with PFAS from industrial charges. So there are farms out there that have higher levels of contamination than any factory town that I've ever heard about.
I hate to ask.
And that has huge implications for the food chain. So go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I just need to know I hate to ask what sewage sludge is, but so I'm clear, it's supposed to it does fertilize the soil. It also to grow better crops, but it also poisons the crops at the same time. Is that what I'm hearing? What is it? It's human sewage that they spread over
human sewage that they spread over agricultural lands all over this country, and sometimes organic farms. It's been done several generations past because these chemicals persist in the environment forever, basically. These organic farms are discovering that, that the milk they're producing has levels of these chemicals that blows away our safety standards for those chemicals. So this has implications for our entire food supply, and there's only a few places where they've even begun to investigate this. So for people who don't live someplace with drinking water contamination or contaminated soil, the main source of exposure is food. So there was a recent study that found eating a single portion of locally caught freshwater fish could increase your blood levels as much as drinking polluted water for entire months. So there's parts of our food supply that are highly, highly contaminated. But again, we're just beginning to grapple with that.
Just beginning to grapple with so much of this, which is why your book uncovers a lot of it and is getting such a major reaction. Going back to Hoosick Falls and Michael, what's his last name again? Icky, sorry. Didn't know how to pronounce it either. But he is kind of one of the central figures of your story, telling the story of what happens when community activists do something. And it's like, it reminds you of Aaron Brockovich and any other number of activists who stood up specifically against giant corporations with the most expensive, powerful lawyers in the country, and arguably having the government on their side maybe as well. Talk to us about his work and what he discovered and what he's helped and others have helped change.
So Michael Hickey, like I said, is the unlikeliest of possible activists. But in 2014, after losing several friends and relatives to cancer, he decided to test his drinking water. And the thing is that Michael struggled in science in school, didn't consider himself much of a student. He didn't really trust. So the way he discovered, the way he figured out that the drinking water might have been contaminated is there was a local factory that made Teflon-coated fabric. And his father had worked at the factory, and his father had died a horrible death of kidney cancer. And so at some point, he sat down and Googled Teflon and cancer and called up this huge study that had been done in West Virginia and that had linked the chemical, a specific chemical called PFOA, to 6 serious diseases, including kidney cancer, which is what his father had died of. And because the factory was right next to the village well field, he began to suspect that the entire village's drinking water might be contaminated. So he spent several months just trying to get a handle on the research because he knew he couldn't afford to get this wrong, that if it were to become public that the drinking water was contaminated, that it would have a devastating effect on the village. And so then he eventually approached this local doctor. He was probably the most beloved figure in the community. His name is Marcus Martinez. And Marcus's family had run the main medical practice in the community since the 1950s. And he and his father had documented unusually high rates of rare aggressive cancer in their patients. And so he thought there might be something to Michael's theory. And so they approached the mayor together about getting the drinking water tested. The mayor talked to the state. The state said it wasn't necessary. And so that's what led Michael to test the water himself. Now, he thought when he got those results, he would hand them off to the mayor, and that would be the end of the story, that the government would take it from there. But that's not what happened. Instead, he and Marcus and other community residents ended up spending a decade fighting for clean drinking water. And oftentimes, while going through incredible dealing with their own very grave health problems. So Marcus Martinez, shortly after they approached the mayor the first time, he was diagnosed with a rare aggressive cancer. And so the entire time he was fighting this battle, he was fighting for his life. And so there were other residents who got involved, and among them a high school music teacher whose 2-year-old daughter had extremely high levels of the chemical PFOA in her blood, a young mother who had put everything she had into a dream home for her family, only to learn that her private well was contaminated. So I followed all of these people for 8 years. I was like a fly on the wall of their lives. And it was a harrowing journey, but they ended up accomplishing some really remarkable things that I would have never envisioned possible when I started researching this book.
I mean, I don't want to give away, but I mean, there's some pretty important outcomes as a result of their activism that started so small. But let's just talk a little bit about the obstacles here and the interests here, because it would seem that every single living person has an interest in being concerned about the dangers here. You can't be a wealthy investor, including the board of these companies.
Yeah.
They're polluting. You mentioned DuPont and 3M and several other companies, and so it's in everybody's interest. So obviously, there's a lot of companies making a lot of money. The lawsuits, you mentioned liability issues. What are the and who are the interests that are in the way if it's in everybody's interest, every special interest to lobby against them because it's your family that could get sick, even including in your super wealthy community, because there's no stopping the spread of these forever chemicals? What are the obstacles? Who are the adversaries in the way of trying to stop this, clean it up?
There are companies that make billions of dollars a year on these chemicals, and they did a very good job for a long time in terms of spinning the science. So a lot of what we know about the industry cover-up was brought to light by litigation in 2001 or earlier. The EPA was put on notice that these chemicals were extremely harmful and were probably in drinking water nationwide in 2001, but nobody acted. So the obstacles, you have powerful corporations who are attempting to downplay the science. You have a regulatory system that doesn't really give regulators much power to act. And you have the revolving door. So people who end up in regulatory agencies, oftentimes they toggle back and forth between jobs in government and more lucrative jobs in lobbying in the private sector. And so, and of course you have the lobbying itself. So it is enormously difficult to get a chemical regulated in this country. In fact, the EPA has only restricted 8 chemicals in its 40-year history. And that's baked in. The system presumes chemicals are safe until proven otherwise. And most of the 80,000 chemicals that are used in commerce in the United States have never even been tested for safety, at least not that we know of, because industry conducts a lot of secret testing.
You talk about the wins and the power at the state level.
Yeah.
State legislators have a lot of interest in this. Tell me a little bit more. Tell me about some of the activism and what that's led to in states around the country.
So as I was reporting, as I was following the story in Hoosick Falls, you suddenly had first neighboring communities learn their drinking water was contaminated, and then millions of people around the country learned their drinking water was contaminated. So at this point, nearly half of all Americans are known to be drinking water that is contaminated with these chemicals. And as the contamination crisis spread, you started having these unlikely activists spring up all over the country. So right. Firefighters, farmers, suburban moms, people of both political parties, people who'd never taken any interest in political issues before, but who took a strong interest in this because the stakes were so personal. It was a chemical in their drinking water, in their blood, a chemical that had ruined their business. And these people coalesced into a very, very powerful force that has driven a huge amount of litigation. So there are more than 15,000 lawsuits pending against manufacturers, but also an incredible amount of legislation on the state level. So at least 14 states have adopted full or partial bans on PFAS in consumer products. And we're talking about the entire class of chemicals, all 9,000 chemicals. That is not the way we regulate chemicals in this country. We normally do it one by one. So this is a complete paradigm shift that's happening as a result of the unique problems that these chemicals pose. There's also bans on PFAS and firefighting foam and sewage sludge. These are much more upstream solutions than anything that's been considered on the federal level. And maybe I could just give a statistic to illuminate the scale. So right now, 30 states have adopted more than 155 bills restricting PFAS. And this trend has only accelerated since Trump took office. So currently there are 200 bills pending in state legislatures, and many of them are in red states: Oklahoma, Texas, Montana. Montana is weighing a consumer product bill. Texas, there's an entire county that's been declared a state of emergency because of the sewage sludge has so heavily contaminated ranches. Texas is weighing a bill, a Republican-sponsored bill, that would criminalize the distribution of sewage sludge with higher than a certain level of PFAS in it. So it just shows you just how bipartisan this issue is, and the kind of unlikely people driving it.
One really fascinating thing to do in my prep to talk to you about your really important new book is to go to Google or whatever search engine I use, Google, and put in forever chemicals and then hit news. And then you see all of the different news stories that are reporting. And obviously they're not all the same and all over the place, but the headlines are not from, weeks ago. They're every day. There are stories, and they're often localized or state stories. And you mentioned Texas. I don't know if this is the bill you're referring to. One day ago, bill aimed at studying restricting forever chemicals in Texas fails.
Oh, okay. So I was not aware of that. You are more.
I don't know if that's the same bill. This is about studying, restricting. It may or may not be. But the point is more that there is so much more being done now in terms of lawsuits and regulations. And that's super, super important. But talk to me about some of the liabilities that have been proved. And how does that even, how do you do that? How do you prove that your chemical, I'm the only one that I kind of know a little bit about is post 9/11 and what's happened on some of these army bases like Camp Lejeune and the burn pits. But even those, like the burn pits in Afghanistan, a lot of guys that were there around those burn pits in Afghanistan and Iraq, where they basically burn everything that are really sick, or the 9/11 rebel that are really sick, they have a hard time in years of lawsuits and lawyers, and guys are dying as bodies all the way along those lawsuits to connect their cancers or their illnesses to those pollutants, those chemicals. How do you do it? Who's won?
Well, so the lawsuit that I referred to in West Virginia, there was a study that grew out of that, and DuPont actually funded it, I think because they didn't think it would find anything. So they agreed to fund this study, and if it found links between the specific chemical PFOA and disease, then people could file individual personal injury suits. And if not, then DuPont didn't even have to fund filtration for the community. So there's a community with drinking water contamination. But the scientists involved, they were local doctors and scientists, designed the study in a way to really encourage participation. So one of the things they did was pay people for participating. And they ended up getting 80% of residents to participate, 69,000 people. And this study linked this particular chemical to 6 serious diseases. And so people could then file personal injury claims based on this. And so then, since then, there's been more large, sophisticated epidemiological studies that have linked these chemicals to disease. So I think in this particular case, there's just more evidence. And the fact that there's so much evidence makes it easier for people to bring claims. But the lawsuits aren't just about that. So the lawsuits, some of them are personal injury cases. Some of them are brought by water districts with contaminated water. Some of them are brought by states. So I think it's something like 30 states have filed suit against manufacturers for the cost of dealing with these chemicals. And increasingly, you're having consumers file class action lawsuits against brands, companies that have these in their products and don't disclose it. So there's currently a lawsuit against Trojan condoms, a lawsuit against the maker of Band-Aids and Snapple, and there's one against L'Oreal. So there's the tide of litigation is engulfing consumer brands, and that creates, the potential liability boggles the mind. So, and as this is, and so the liability combined with the legislation is actually driving these momentous market shifts. That another thing I never could have imagined when I started working on this story. But 3M, the world's largest manufacturer of PFAS, has announced that it will quit producing them by the end of this year, all 9,000 chemicals.
That's
And
a pretty big deal, and they'll replace it with something else.
well, so they won't. The thing is that they're committing to eliminating the entire class. So everything that has this carbon fluorine bond, the things that make this particular class of chemicals so problematic. And it's not just 3M. So it's 40 major retail chains with $1.7 trillion in combined annual sales have also committed to eliminating or reducing PFAS in their packaging. And I'm talking huge corporations: Apple, McDonald's, Amazon, Home Depot, Dick's Sporting Goods, Taco Bell. The list is huge. It's there's a lot of money involved, and so it's a lot of this has to do with the liability and the reputational liability, because under these state level laws and a similar law that is pending in the European Union, the product bans, companies have to investigate their entire supply chain and figure out where these chemicals are. And once that information is out there, it opens them up both to legal liability, but also, it can be incredibly damaging to their reputation. So businesses are scrambling to get these out of their supply chains. And it's happening much faster than it would with regulation. So regulation moves slowly, markets move fast.
Right. Really well said, and really very, very important. You mentioned your regulation. What I haven't really asked you about, you mentioned the EPA standards, but when it's like one president's EPA is not another president's EPA. And we could talk about what, when Democrats are in charge of the EPA, what they do, and when Republicans are in charge of the EPA, what they do. And the simplest way of saying it is, often I'm very partisan on this, is that they'll appoint, Republicans will appoint actual captains of industry to regulate the industry that they've made their career profiting from often. I mean, and whether it's EPA or HHS, you would think, Lee Zeldin is the head of the EPA, a former New York congressman, and we could talk about him specifically, but it's more important, I think, to just look at so far what their EPA has done. And then also you would think, I don't know if there's an issue or a contradiction between EPA and any other agency and HHS, because, you'd think to make the Make America Healthy Again crew would be against a lot of this stuff. And I think, but at the same time, you might find out that EPA or HHS is headed by an actual bottle of fluorine. Like, who knows who's in charge and what their interests are.
I mean, you do have a former industry lobbyist in charge of the Office of Chemical Safety.
Shocking.
And this is true. This may have been true of past Republican administrations, but Trump is a whole different story. The degree to which, people from the industries that they're supposed to be regulating are actually put in the regulators.
Yeah.
So, but this issue has played out a little differently than others. So Lee Zeldin, for example, when he was a congressman, he represented a Long Island district that had intense PFAS contamination. And he was part of there's a bipartisan PFAS task force. So he called on the EPA to regulate PFAS. He sponsored PFAS legislation. Now, in his role as the head of the EPA, he hasn't necessarily followed the same course. So recently, the EPA announced, last year, the EPA had set binding standards for 6 PFAS in drinking water, and some of them were near zero levels because, as I said before, the EPA doesn't consider them safe at any level. The Trump EPA recently rolled back 4 of those standards. So it kept in place the standards for the 2 best studied chemicals, but those are chemicals that were also voluntarily phased out a decade ago.
It's crazy. I mean,
they're still everywhere. They're still in drinking water, but yes, it's crazy. I mean, it makes, and it will set, it will set people back. It'll set communities back that have drinking water contamination. However, many states have adopted their own standards, and a lot of states are actually codifying the EPA's old standards, so they're making them state law so that their residents will have the same level of protection they would have had, under these EPA standards.
This book is published. You're talking about, your research over a decade pretty much, and what you learned, and making it very real by introducing us to these actual real Americans that you got to know and basically embedded in their lives in a way. And you're talking about this book, and that's awesome. But like, will you as a journalist stay on this issue? Is this going to be like your life's work is forever chemicals and covering them and what happens?
I don't know if it'll be my life's work, but I'll stay on it for a while.
Good.
I mean, it's such an important topic, and there's headlines every day. And at this point I have this wealth of knowledge about it. So I feel like I have something to contribute. And the more people understand, the better.
What about you? Like, how do you make decisions for the health of yourself and your family? You write about the guilt that you felt and not knowing something, trying to do the right thing and accidentally doing the wrong thing. And some of us won't even want to know about some of these choices. But given, I try to have live my life around rational fears, the things that I can kind of control. And when it comes to like health and everything, sometimes things are misleading. Sometimes we're told this is good for us or this is bad for us, and it's impossible. And I don't like these people who say, I do my own research. So I happen to be, good friends with a couple doctors, and I just generally say to them, who are researchers, whatever you do, I'm going to do. I'm not going to challenge you. So what kind of a person are you? You have all of these sources. What kind of different choices have you made for your life or family? By the way, I had one expert tell me and scare the hell out of me about heating stuff up in the microwave in plastic. And then somebody else told me there's actually no research that says it's actually that bad. It's just a scare. And it's not like that person came from the plastic lobby. It was just scientific consensus. So how do you know?
Let me first correct the record on that. There is evidence that heating plastic up in the microwave causes it to release toxic chemicals like.
It's hard to believe. It would make sense, but
so does putting plastic in the dishwasher, and so does leaving them out in the sun. So UV rays causes the release of these chemicals. And so if you use plastic, you definitely should not be putting it in the microwave, in the dishwasher, or
is all plastic equal? Do I see like the hard plastic bottle that I buy my Poland Springs in? I get these giant bottles now versus the thin plastic I buy, something from the grocery store, or it comes from.
Not all plastic is equal, but studies have shown that the majority of plastics contain toxic chemicals, that alter your hormones, and chemicals that do that are extremely harmful for a variety of reasons. So, and you don't have any way of knowing which ones do and which ones don't. So it's better to err on the side of caution.
What else for you? We could go through a list, like whether. So
I filter my drinking water, and I use an undersink system. There are two kinds of systems that are recommended, undersink systems. One is reverse osmosis, and the other is multi-stage systems that involve carbon. And there's an organization called NSF that independently certifies filters to show that which ones remove PFAS. So filtering your drinking water, I filter my drinking water. I avoid things that are nonstick, waterproof, grease-proof. I avoid eating locally caught freshwater fish. And then there are some online databases that I consult for information. So for example, the Environmental Working Group has a database that has information about what kind of chemicals are in personal care products. So believe it or not, PFAS are in the majority of personal care products. So things like lipstick, mascara, lotion. There is also a blog called Momavation, and this is sort of a mommy influencer, and she has actually taken to testing consumer products for PFAS, and she names names. So she tested condoms, lubricants, contact lenses, Band-Aids, various types of food, and there were levels that indicated intentionally added PFAS in some variations of all of these.
But these things, is she like? I mean, can anyone do a test? You don't have to have a degree.
Well, it's expensive, so you commission a lab to do the testing, And so she has product links, so people buy through her website, and that's how
Interesting.
she pays for the testing. But that's one of the few places that you can get, you know, that names the names of brands that do contain PFAS and that don't. So that's a resource for consumers, and that's something that I use. But honestly, your individual decisions only make, they make a difference, but they can't entirely protect you. And I actually take some comfort in that, because once I realized that I was going to be exposed no matter what, I felt a little less guilt about not being able to protect myself and my family. And I know that may sound perverse, but it is, you know, these chemicals are everywhere, and you can't know exactly where they are. So
I read that, and I totally understand. I think it's a very reasonable emotion, by the way. I don't want to, at the end here, talk to an investigative journalist and do psychology, but I mean, like, it's like, we can't, there's very little we can do to control that. It's just, but it's so heartbreaking to think that you might have made a different decision about this or that. But as a parent, myself, my daughters are 17 and 20, a lot of different decisions that we could have made that would have made different outcomes. And the more educated you are, I think the more guilt you have about, oh, I should have known, right? But sometimes, it's a vicious circle, getting
it
trapped.
is. Well,
Yeah.
I think that, not only did I not know, but some of the early stories I wrote about plastic chemicals, I got just a tremendous response from parents who were concerned. And that's part of what's driven me, is that, the more we know about these chemicals, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves.
I think one of the most guilty feelings one might have is the fact that you bought a home, or you live in this community that is now, become really polluted with certain things, and there's not much you can do about it because you can't get out. You can't necessarily sell your house in a community that's become polluted. That's not good for your home value, is my understanding, which is why a mayor and other people would want to protect that kind of information from getting out. Real estate folks, there's a lot of interest in protecting that, right?
Yes. And I would say it's utterly devastating to discover that the water you've been drinking is contaminated. So one of the people I was following, Emily Marpy, I mentioned that her private well was contaminated. It had levels that are 500 times the EPA's current safety limit. Her family has blood levels on par with a DuPont factory worker. And she had to stay in that home. She was downwind from the plant, so she knew that she was being exposed, not just through the water. Her family was being exposed, not just through the water. But she told me at some point that every day she stayed in the house, she felt like she was killing her children.
That's brutal.
Slowly, but surely. It's incredibly brutal. It's incredibly brutal. But people like Emily take that anguish and have turned it into something powerful, and they're changing things.
Yes, and you do a great job documenting her and so many others. The book is so good. And Bill Boyle just showed up at our live podcast here saying Mariah is awesome, and indeed she is a great referral and endorsement. I'm glad we finally got this done. I'm really happy to see how much attention the book is being given. So please go buy it. They poisoned the world, life and death in the age of forever chemicals. And then Google forever chemicals, and then reference some of those sources that Mariah just said to protect yourself as much as you can, you and your family. I hope we'll talk again when I finish the book. And as this comes up, it is not going anywhere. It's here forever. And we're going to continue to discuss it and learn about it, and how to protect ourselves and how to change the world for our kids and their kids. So really important work. Really, congratulations, Mariah. And thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
All right. I'm going to end the stream and then say bye to you. Thanks for everybody for watching live. Really appreciate you stopping by. And